All right, everybody. The debate's coming up with Dr. Mike Licona and Dr. Bart Ehrman. I really hope you go sign up, mythvisionpodcast.com/resurrection. It is in the description, and I pinned it in a comment below, so you can go do that while there's an early bird special. 7-hour debate. They're going to be going into almost everything you can imagine, critically assessing both sides. And Dr. Ehrman is very confident, as you will see in this video, that Dr. Licona is going to be found wanting. He's going to be scrambling with the information that is brought up by Dr. Ehrman. I asked some pointing questions today I think that are very relevant to the issue of the resurrection when it comes to the apocalypse and the end. If Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection and the final resurrection is coupled to that, why is there this divorce of the resurrection of the saints, or the final resurrection, and Jesus' resurrection? What's the deal with it? There's this huge gap? Or did Jesus predict this stuff would have happened back then, and Paul believed that Jesus' resurrection was a sign that the final resurrection was about to happen? But if it didn't happen, did Jesus' resurrection even happen? We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Eric Lambert. Dr. Bart Ehrman, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you, everybody. You just saw the intro. Be sure to sign up before it's too late. There's never been a debate like this. 7 hours. So I don't know if they're going to end up finally discussing their favorite foods or what you guys might end up talking about this whole time. I've actually heard people say that in the chat, like, what is there to talk about for 7 hours? There's a lot to talk about. And so I just want to maybe give you a chance to explain, what do you expect is going to be discussed in depth?
Well, if Mike just read his book verbatim for the debate, it would take him 15 hours to get through that. We'll have no problems talking about things.
I agree.
Well, there are all sorts of issues that would require significant discussion. And one of the frustrations with some debate formats is that you've got lots of things to say, and you don't have a chance to say them. There'll also be questions and answers, and there'll be, so it'll be mixed up. It's not just going to be hearing me drone on for 40 minutes and hearing him drone on for 40 minutes and hearing him. It's not going to be like that. It's actually going to be active with a lot of different components to it. But there's so much to talk about. I mean, if you're talking about the resurrection, for one thing, you're talking about what kind of sources do you have? And it has to do with, can you trust the Gospels? So it's really a much bigger question than the resurrection. It's, can you trust the Gospels when they say something? In the four Gospels, the main thing they want to say is that Jesus died for your sins and he was raised from the dead. Well, do they present a reliable case for that? So that's one kind of set of questions, and we'll talk about the Gospels. Mike and I have very different views about the New Testament, and certainly different views about whether historians can talk about things like, is the Bible inspired? I mean, how can a historian talk about whether the Bible is inspired? Of course, a historian might think the Bible is inspired, might believe that, but is that a historical statement? I mean, how can a historian show what God's doing? Try and show me what God did yesterday. Really? How do you do that as a historian? And so you have questions about the inspiration of the Bible and whether it's trustworthy, and because, okay, then you've got issues of history. I mean, do historians, I was just indicating, do historians talk about things like resurrections? If you talk about resurrection of Jesus and say that you can historically demonstrate it, okay, which other resurrections can you demonstrate? Oh no, just that one. Why just that one? There are others talked about in ancient sources. Yeah, but this is the one that's best attested. Really? Okay, so you mean if you have three people who say that then you can do that historically, but if you only have two, it's what? And so, but the big question is, I mean, can historians talk about miracles at all? I mean, what historian talks about miracles exactly? I mean, name me a historian of the Revolutionary War that describes the miracles that happened. The life of Napoleon, do you describe miracles? What? Of course not. I mean, read a biography of Washington. You don't read about miracles. What? Why not? Because historians don't deal with miracles. So to say that historians ought to show that the miracle of Jesus' resurrection happened, what does that even mean? Historians don't deal with that kind of thing.
So this begs me to ask that, are historical evidence-wise, if we're looking at sources, is resurrection something that happened more often than once? You say yes. Can you give me a few examples real quick?
Well, I can certainly give examples of people who were taken up to heaven when they died, who were alive one minute and up in heaven the next. And so, I mean, the founder of Rome, Romulus, was taken up to heaven without dying. Near contemporary of Jesus, Apollonius of Tyana, was put up for charges before the Roman authorities and ascended to heaven. And so, you certainly have people brought back from the dead. The thing about the resurrection of Jesus, though, is an important point that Mike and I would both agree on, is that it is not being described as a near-death experience. And so if you've got somebody in the Gospels, for example, who dies and then is brought back from the dead, you could say, yeah, well, they had a near-death experience, happened to a cousin of mine. But in the case of Jesus, the whole point is that he didn't come back from the dead to die again later. The resurrections that he died was taken up to heaven. He was really raised all the way up, not just raised to live around and live for another 20 years. And so that's the miracle. And that's what you can attest in other sources for other people.
So this question, I kind of phrased this conversation in a way of saying, you're going to show why you can't historically, demonstrate that the resurrection happened. But the question I'd like to know is it historically demonstrable that Jesus probably didn't resurrect? So while he's going to be making a case to say he did, and you're going to say, no, look, you can't, are you taking a neutral position and saying you can't and historians shouldn't? Or is there evidence based on these sources to maybe think actually he didn't rise and another phenomena might be taking place?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Jesus rose from the dead, and I'm going to be showing why I think that. But the thing is, it's really, at the end of the day, it's not a discussable item historically. And so that has to be laid out pretty carefully, because people will say things like, what's the best evidence? And my view is there's no evidence. How can you have evidence for a miracle? But there are reasons for thinking he wasn't raised from the dead. For example, our sources are hopelessly confused on the major points about the resurrection. And so are these the kinds of sources? The sources are written by people who are fervently believing in Jesus. And are these the kinds of sources you use that a historian wants? And so one reason for thinking he wasn't raised from the dead is because I don't think there was a tomb. But I don't think Romans didn't allow people to be buried. And so I will be mounting arguments for why I don't think it happened. But my bottom line is going to be that even if it did happen, it's not a historical belief. There aren't historical beliefs. There's history. And if you've got beliefs, that's something other than history.
I thought about this as well. While Christians love to talk about the resurrection, Dr. Ehrman, I wondered if we could tackle it let's put it like this. Apocalyptic prophet. The way you wrote your book about this Jesus figure who's waiting on the end, Christians love to die on the hill arguing about this resurrection idea that Jesus rose from the dead because it is the center to their faith. But if we can show demonstrably that expectations that were supposed to happen, like Mark 13 and the end of the world, a new heaven and new earth, et cetera, were anticipated to happen within his lifetime, and even he can't get that right, but we're supposed to believe God raised him from the dead, isn't this another way of approaching it, saying, what are the likeliness that this actually happened? This guy rose from the dead, but he can't even get the end of the world correct.
You could argue that. I don't think it would be effective because your opponent will say, actually, you're misinterpreting those verses, and that Jesus didn't make that prediction. And others could say, look, just because God raised him from the dead doesn't mean he was perfect. I know Christians who think that Jesus actually committed sins, and that he wasn't all knowledgeable, he wasn't almighty, he was a human, but that God raised him from the dead. And so I don't think his humanity necessarily is a trump card against the resurrection.
Well, I thought that I would think that an apocalyptic prophet's thinking the final resurrection would happen. Like that was part of the expectation, is that it wasn't just Jesus's resurrection that was anticipated. And I know that there are various voices, and the New Testament is not one cohesive message on this topic. But Paul seems to have said, well, he's the Son of God since he was raised, but he's the first fruit of the resurrection, like meaning there's going to be some following very soon after this.
Yeah. I think that's right. That is what I think Jesus did think is going to happen in his generation.
So it just developed. It's a developing, like you say, there's like tree rings that keep developing out from an original apocalyptic prophet.
I mean, when I was in seminary at Princeton Theological Seminary, I'd say a large number of my colleagues who were studying for ministry agreed that Jesus was wrong about when it was going to happen. And they thought he got raised from the dead. And so I don't think those two things are linked the way that an outsider would think they are linked. You think, well, you can't have both ways. Well, yeah, people do have it both ways, because they say, look, he's fully human and fully divine. But if he's fully human, it means he's fully human. And
yeah. I just see so many problems with, you know where I'm coming from. Of course, I'm coming from
that's why we're not believers, but it's not a logical contradiction.
Okay. Look, you just mentioned he's man, he's God, he's both. This raises some red flags in my ears. There are a lot of scholars like you who will say there's this development that is growing about this divinity of this guy named Jesus. And, I was listening to an interview last week with Mike Jones. Inspiring Philosophy is a huge Christian apologist YouTube channel, asking Mike Licona about Jesus being God in Mark, right? And he said, look, can you show us how he's equated with Yahweh in Mark? And, I still, even as a non-believer, wouldn't have a problem if they found remnants or elements of this, so to speak, in Mark. But he used the example of Jesus walking on water to show Yahweh walked on water. These are elements within Mark that are kind of, you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I know this, yeah.
What do you say to that?
It's completely bogus.
How would you respond to the walking on water particular?
The early Christian view is that God gave Jesus his authority. It didn't make him God. It didn't make him Yahweh. Yahweh bestowed his own authority on Jesus. So if Jesus does something that Yahweh did, that's because he was authorized to do it. That's how it worked in the ancient world. If you were the king and you sent a messenger, the messenger was treated like you. Like if you sent a messenger to a village, they would treat him like the king, because he's representing you and he has your authority. Jesus in the early Christian tradition had God's authority, and so he was treated like God. But there's a difference between having the authority of God and being equal with God, and the difference between that and being identical with God. Being identical with Yahweh, I don't know, these evangelicals who say this thing, I'm puzzled by it. And, I know people have been writing about, can't understand why I'm puzzled, because this is what people have always said. No, they have not always said it. And quoting Justin Martyr at me is pointless, by the way. I don't know, you probably don't read this, but I mean, I just think that, I'm sorry, this is not the historical view of Christianity, so far as I know, and I've studied it for a long time. So maybe if people can point me to a correction, like in the New Testament, then I'd be fine. But the fact Jesus walks on the water, yes, of course Mark portrays Jesus walking. And yes, Mark does see Jesus as a divine being. I agree. Mark ascribes divinity to Jesus. Mm-hmm. He does not think he's Yahweh. The idea that Yahweh and Jesus, they still believe in the Trinity, I assume. So I'm not sure who's the second. I mean, if the Son is Yahweh, I'm not sure what the Father is. In fact, I've never had anybody explain that to me, but traditionally the Father is Yahweh and Jesus is his Son.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that it seems anachronistic when you already hold to a creedal consensus Trinitarian position within Christendom, and then you're reading the Gospels, you find elements of him being divine. It's easy for them to see and find ways to equate. That's why I run into these problems. He doesn't know the end, but he's equal with the Father, and only his Father understands the end. I'm big into this apocalyptic thing because that's one of the reasons that it sealed the door shut for me, is finding out that it was expected. So my last question is, in that vein of apocalypticism, I recently just interviewed John J. Collins 2 or 3 days ago, and we were talking about how the end did not happen. He looked at me like I was crazy because I asked him very basic questions that you would think a 3-year-old would know, like, what does heaven and earth mean? When he says heaven and earth will pass away, and he's like, heaven and earth. And there are people, believe it or not, these preterists that I always bring to the table with you, who think heaven and earth is a covenant term for God's covenant people, or the first covenant is a heaven and earth, which is the Mosaic covenant, or some other redefinition. As you could see, this is what they do. So Mark 13, is that the end? Is the destruction of the Jerusalem temple the end? Or are these the signs that they expected the end would happen after these things would take place?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by end. I mean, my sense is that in the Gospels, the idea is that the current order of things will be destroyed and that a good kingdom will come to earth. So there'll still be an earth. So the earth isn't going to blow up. And that there will be humans here, and that there'll be life here. And so what's being described, I think, is the destruction of the current order, but it's not the end of the world in the literal sense.
Do you think it's fair to say that that current order is the Jerusalem temple, their priest, their setup, and limiting it only to that? Or do you think that the end of the current order is literally a universal understanding of the earth and the problems within the world, et cetera, et cetera?
The difficulty is that in these descriptions, you have the sun turning dark and the moon to blood and stars falling from the sky. And if that is all literal, then literally the universe collapses on itself. So there's no place for a kingdom of God anymore. I don't think that Jesus talked about a new creation of the heavens and an earth. I think that in the book of Revelation, you it calls it the new heavens and an earth, but it doesn't mean that the old one is destroyed. It means that the powers that are in control are destroyed. And so my sense is that I think Jesus was talking about the destruction of the current political order is going to be destroyed, and that it's going to have cosmic consequences because the forces of evil that empower these kingdoms will be destroyed. And so the cosmic destruction is symbolized by the destruction of the sun, moon, and stars. But it's just a guess. He might have thought the whole universe is going to be destroyed, and then God was going to make a new earth. I really don't know the answer to that. But it's the problem with symbolism is that you can get lots of it, you get most of it, but some of the details usually don't add up, and it's because symbols are not direct narrative, linear descriptions of things.
Yeah. It's been this tug of war for me. Tom Wright writes that it was fulfilled, and John J. Collins thinks it wasn't.
No, of course it wasn't. Yeah, I know. The destruction of Jerusalem is not what he's talking about. I mean, that's clear. Just read what he says. It's not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's talking about the destruction of the entire created order. But the earth, the powers of this world, and so including the Roman Empire. And so it's not just the destruction of Jerusalem.
You could see how someone would be confused, especially if they're not.
It's confusing. Yeah, it's confusing.
Yeah, it is. Dr. Ehrman, I'm excited for this debate. I can't wait to see what happens here. And I will say, I interviewed Mike Licona, and at the end I said, how bad do you think you're going to beat him? And he said, well, I'll tell you this. This was his words, and I'd love to get your words on this. His words were, well, I think I have better arguments than him, but nobody can beat Bart in a debate. Bart's way better at communicating.
Yeah. I don't think he has better arguments than me. I really don't. No, I don't. He doesn't. And, if instead of having everybody watch, you should have a group of historians evaluate his claims that you can prove that Jesus was raised from the dead. Not Christian historians, just historians. Historians. Is this the sort of thing you can show? Just survey some historians, see what they say. What do I think? So my view of these debates is that, everyone who is engaged in a debate, 101, everyone who comes out of the debate thinks, man, I really crushed that guy. You're going out of the room saying that, and the other guy's saying the same thing.
Yep. Oh man, I really do appreciate your time, Dr. Ehrman, and everybody go sign up right now because the end is nigh and the signs are right there. We've just given them to you, so just remember that, and don't forget, we are MythVision.